King KAMBUF, www.kambuf.com. King KAMBUF, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, February 1817 or 18, February 20th, 1895, was an African American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and a statesman. After escaping from slavery in Maryland, he became a national leader of the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts and New York, becoming famous for his oratory and incisive anti-slavery writings. According, he was described by abolitionists in his time as living counterexample to the slaveholders' argument that slaves lacked the intellectual capacity to function as independent American citizens. Northerners at the time found it hard to believe that such a great orator had once been a slave. It was a response to his belief that Douglass wrote his first autobiography. Let me make sure that this shit is on repeat. It is, so we don't mess up and lose the beat here today. Douglass in 1879, a gray-haired man, stern in the face, strong nose, rigid brow, broad chest, wide stature, hair might be called a mess. It's all good. Washington State Minister resident to Haiti. How about that? In office November 14th, 1889, July 30th, 1891, appointed by Benjamin Harrison, succeeded by John E. W. Thompson, succeeded by John U. S. Newman. Details about Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, we said that, died February 20th, 1895 at the age of 78 or 77 in Washington, D.C. He lived at Mount Hope, or that's where he's arrested. He was a Republican. He had two spouses, Anne and Murray Helen Pitts. His parents, Harriet Bailey, Aaron Anthony, allegedly. Relatives, Douglass family. Occupation, he was an abolitionist, a suffragist, an author, an editor, and a diplomat. His signature was quite crisp, with a swift and F with the Frederick Douglass. Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies describing his experience as a slave and his narrative of life of the Frederick Douglass, an American slave, 1845, which became a bestseller and is influential in promoting the cause of abolition, and was his second book, My Bondage as a Freedman, 1855. Following the Civil War, Douglass was an active campaigner for rights for the freed slave. He wrote his last autobiography, Life of the Times of Frederick Douglass, first published in 1881 and revised in 92. 3 years later, his death. The book covers events both during and after the Civil War. Douglass also actively supported women's suffrage and held several public offices. Without his permission, Douglass became the first African American nominated for Vice President of the United States as the running mate and the vice presidential nominee of the Victory Hoodwall on the Equal Rights Party ticket. Douglass believed in dialogue and in making alliances across racial and ideologies divides, as well as the liberal values of the U.S. Constitution. A radical abolitionist under the motto "No Union with Slaveholders" criticized Douglass' willingness to engage in dialogue with slave owners. He replied, "I would unite with anybody to do the right and nobody to do the wrong." life as a slave. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into slavery on the east shore of Chesapeake Bay in Talbot County, Maryland. The plantation was between Hillsborough and Cordova. His birthplace was like his grandmother's cabin east of the Tamper's Corner. They given real logistics and navigations and shit. And the West Tucano Creek. His first autobiography, Douglas stated, I have no accurate knowledge of my age. Never have I seen my authentic record containing it. However, based on the existing records of Douglas' former owner, Aaron Anthony, historian Dickinson J. Peterson determined that Douglas was born in February of 1818. Though the exact date of his birth is unknown, he was chose to celebrate February 14th as his birthday, remembering that his mother called him his little Valentine. Birth family. Douglas was of mixed race, which was likely included Native American and African and his mother's side, as well as European. In contrast, his father was almost certainly white, according to historians David W. Blight in his 2018 biography of Douglas. Douglas said his mother, Harriet Bailey, gave him his name, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and after he escaped from the North in September 1838, he took the short name Douglas, having already dropped the two middle names he later wrote in his earliest times with his mother. The opinion was whispered that my master was my father, but the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant. I was in common custom in part of Maryland, from which I ran away to part children from other mothers in very early age. I do not recollect and ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me at night when she would lay down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I wake she was gone. After separation from his mother during infancy, young Frederick lived with his maternal grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who was also a slave, and his maternal grandfather, Isaac, who was free. Betsy, who lived until 1849, Frederick's mother, remained on the plantation about 12 miles away, 19 kilometers away, only visiting Frederick a few times before her death when she was 7 years old. When he was 7 years old, returning much later, about 1883, to purchase land in Talbot County. That was the meaning to him. He was invited to address the colored school. I once knew a little colored boy whose mother and father died when he was 6 years old. He was a slave and he had no care for him. He slept on the dirt floor in the hover room, and in the cold weather he crawled into the meal bag head foremost and leave his feet in the ash. He kept them warm. Often he would roast an ear of corn and eat it to satisfy his hunger, and many times he crawled under the barn or the stable to secure some eggs, which he would roast in the fire and eat. That boy did not wear pants like you do, but torn linen shirt. Schools were unknown to him, and he learned to spell from an old Webster spelling book, and would read and write the posters on the cellar look and the barn doors, while boys and men would help him. He would preach and speak. It soon became well known. He became president, elector, United States Marshal, United States Recorder, United States diplomat, and accumulated some wealth. He bore wealth, brought clothes, and didn't have to divide crumbs with the dogs under the table. That boy was Frederick Douglass. Early learning and experience. the old family. At age 6, Frederick was separated from his grandparents and moved to the White House plantation where Aaron Anthony worked overseeing. As Anthony died in 1826, Douglas was given Lucretta Ludd, wife of Lou Thomas. Hugh sent to serve Thomas' brother Hugh Ludd in Baltimore. Douglas felt that he was lucky to be in the city where he said slaves were almost freemen compared to those on the plantation. When Douglas was about 12, Hugh Old's wife Sophia began teaching him the alphabet. From the day he arrived, she saw to it that Douglas was properly fed and clothed, that was slept in a bed, his sheets and blanket. Douglas described her kind and tender-hearted woman who treated him as she supposed one human being treat another. Hugh alludes to prove the tutoring, feeling that literacy would encourage slaves to desire freedom. Douglas later referred to this the first decided anti-slavery lecture he had ever heard. Very well thought, I wrote Douglas, acknowledging unfit a child to be a slave. I extensively asserted to proposition, and from that moment I understood the direct path from slavery to freedom. At last, under her husband's influence, Sophia came to believe that educating and slavery were incompatible, and one day snatched the newspaper away from Douglas. She stopped teaching him altogether and hid all potential reading material, including her Bible, from him. He was autobiography. Douglas related how he learned to read from white children in the neighborhood by observing the writings on the men in the womb, and he worked. Douglas continued secretly to teach himself to read and write. He later often said knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom. As Douglas began to read the newspaper, pamphlets, political material, and books of every description, this new realm of thought led to the question and condemned the institution of slavery. In later years, Douglas credited the Columbian orator and anthology and discovery about the age of 12 with clarifying and defining his views on freedom and human rights. First published in 1797, the book is classroom reading containing essays, speeches, and dialogues to assist students in learning reading and grammar. He later learned that his mother had also been literate, about which would later declare, I am quite willing and even happy to attribute any love of the letter I possess, and for which I have got, despite prejudice, only too much credit, not to admit Anglo-Saxon paternity, but to the negative genius of my sably, unprotected, uncultivated mother. I belong to a race whose mental endowments it is a present fashionable to hold disparagement and contempt. William Freeland. When Douglas was hired out to William Freeland, he gathered eventually 30 more slaves, male slaves. On Sunday, he sometimes even on the weekends and Sabbath literary school. For about 6 months, they studied relatively unnoticed while Freeland remained complacent about their activities on the plantation. Others began to insist about their slaves being educated like this. One Sunday, they burst into the gathering armed with clubs and stones to disperse the congregation permanently. Edward Coben in 1833, Thomas Adult took Douglas back to Hugh. As means of punishment, Hugh Douglas later wrote, Thomas sent Douglas to work Eddie Covey, a poor farmer who had a reputation as a slave breaker. He whipped Douglas so frequently that his wounds had the time to heal. Douglas later said that frequent whippings broke his body, soul, and spirit. The 16-year-old Douglas finally rebelled against the beatings. However, they fought back after Douglas won a physical confrontation. Conveying never tried to beat him again. You damn right you didn't. Recounting his beatings at Convey's form a narrative of life of Frederick Douglass in American slave. Douglass described himself as a man transformed into a brute. Still, Douglass came to see his physical fight with Covey as a life transforming and induced. The story in his autobiography as such. You see how a man made a slave. Shall see how a slave was made a man. Let's say that again. Still, Douglass came to see his physical fight with Covey as life transforming and introduced the story in his autobiography as such. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave is made a man. From slavery to freedom, Douglass first tried to escape the freeland who has hired him from his owner, but was unsuccessful. In 1837, Douglass met and fell in love with Anne Murray, a free woman in Baltimore about 5 years his senior. Her free status strengthened his belief in possibility of gaining his own freedom. Murray encouraged him to support his efforts by aid in money. On September 3rd, 1838, Douglass successfully escaped by boarding a northern bound train to Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore railroads. There were abroad and he thought to be a short distance east of a train depot in recent developed neighborhoods between a modern neighborhood of East Harbor. Literally, this was the depot was a president of Fleet Street as the basin of the Baltimore Harbor on the northwest branch of the Passacoquah River. Research cited in 2021, however, suggests that Douglass in fact boarded the train in Canton Depot of Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad on Boston Street and Cannington neighborhood of Baltimore further east. Young Douglass reached Harvard de Grace, Maryland, in Hartford County, in the northeast corner of the state, along with southwest shores of Sacagawea River, which flowed into the Chesapeake Bay. Although this placed him only about 20 miles, 32 kilometers from Maryland-Pennsylvania state line, it was easier to continue by rail through Delaware, another slave state, dressed in sailor's uniform provided to him by Murray, who also gave him her savings to cover his travel costs. He carried identification papers and protection papers that had abstained from free black seamen. Hey man, are you serious? Now that's oh my god, now that's your girl. Are you serious? These broads, wow. These broads are helping smuggle cats out. You feel me? These broads are out here helping smuggle cats out. You feel me? Douglass crossed these wide Sacagawea rivers by the railroad steams, ferrying Harvey de Grace to the Perryville in opposite shores in Cecil County. Then continued to train cross the state line to Wilmington, Delaware, a large port at the head of the Delaware Bay. From there, because the rail line was not yet completed, he went by steamboat along the Delaware River further northeast to the Quaker city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, an anti-slavery stronghold. He continued the safe house of noted abolitionist David Ruggles in New York City. His entire journey to freedom took him less than 24 hours. Douglass later wrote of his arrival in New York City, "I have often been asked how I felt when first I found myself on free soil, and my readers may share the same curiosity. There I scarcely anything in my experience about which I could not give a more satisfactory answer. A new world will open upon me. If life is more than a breath and a quick round of blood, I live more in the day than a year of my slave life. It was time to joyous excitement with words, but tamely describe me in a letter written to my friends soon after reaching New York. I said, I felt as one might feel upon escaping the den of hunger's lions, anguish and grief like darkness, and ran my duplicit but gladness and joy. Like this rainbow defied the skills of pen and pencil no more. Once Douglas had arrived, he sent for Murray to follow him north to New York. She brought for basics for them to set up home. They were married on September 15th, 1838 by black Presbyterian ministers just 11 days after Douglas had reached New York. After first they adopted Johnson as their married name to divert attention, you see. God bless, amen, you see. Abolitionist and preacher, the Kuti settled. I'm gonna stop right here because I'm emotional, and I'm gonna come back and give y'all some more Frederick Douglass later.